Imagine lying in a hospital bed, your body trembling through contractions that feel like waves of fire tearing through your spine, your fingers gripping the cold metal railing with everything you have left, and the only thought running through your exhausted, terrified mind is, "Where is my husband?" His phone goes to voicemail. Again, you leave a message, your voice cracking between breaths. You tell him the baby is coming. You tell him you're scared. You tell him you need him. And somewhere on the other end of that silence, in a house that you built from the ground up, in a bedroom that still smells like your perfume, your husband is pouring 2 glasses of wine for a woman who is not you. This is the story of Claire Marlow, and before it's over, every single person who underestimated her, starting with the man she married, would understand exactly how catastrophically they had made the wrong choice. Claire had never been the kind of woman who needed anyone to tell her she was remarkable. She knew it quietly, the way that truly strong people always do, not from arrogance, but from a deep and unshakable sense of self that had been forged in difficulty rather than comfort. She had grown up in a small town in Ohio, the daughter of a retired school teacher and a woman who cleaned houses for a living and still came home every night and asked her daughter what she had learned that day. Her parents hadn't had money. They had had values and work ethic, and an almost stubborn belief that a person could build something real if they simply refused to give up. Claire had taken that belief and run with it. She had earned a scholarship to a state university, worked 2 part-time jobs while carrying a full course load, graduated near the top of her class with a degree in real estate finance, and then spent the next 7 years building herself into one of the most quietly respected property analysts in her mid-sized city. She didn't flash her accomplishments. She didn't need to. Her work spoke for itself, and so did her reputation among the small circle of professionals who knew exactly how much she was worth. She had also, over those years, done something that even her colleagues sometimes forgot about. She had been slowly, carefully, and very strategically investing in property. Not flashy commercial developments or risky speculation. Quiet, steady, calculated purchases in neighborhoods that a trained eye told her were about to grow. A duplex here, a modest single-family home there, a commercial strip unit in a transitional district that everyone else had written off. She bought them quietly, managed them diligently, and watched them appreciate in ways that made her smile to herself on quiet Sunday mornings over a cup of coffee. By the time she was 31 years old, Claire Marlow was, on paper, a significantly wealthy woman, not in the flashy look-at-me way that attracted attention, in the deep, structural way that meant she had options. Always options, no matter what life threw at her. And then she met Daniel Hargrove. She met him at an industry event. One of those evening networking gatherings with bad appetizers and too loud music where everyone is pretending to enjoy themselves more than they actually are. Daniel was standing near the bar, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a suit that fit him well and a confidence that filled the room. He was charming in the way that men who've always been told they're exceptional tend to be, effortlessly, almost carelessly so. He laughed easily, spoke with authority about the commercial real estate market, and when he turned his full attention on Claire for the first time, she felt it like a physical thing. He was impressive. She would never deny that. Daniel had built a respectable property development firm from his family's initial seed. Money he sometimes mentioned and sometimes downplayed, depending on the audience. And by 35 he had a name in the industry and a lifestyle that matched it. He drove a black Range Rover. He lived in a penthouse apartment downtown and seemed genuinely at ease in the kind of social spaces that made other people nervous. What Claire didn't see, not at first, not through the warmth of his attention and the intoxication of feeling chosen by someone who seemed to have every option available to him, was that Daniel Hargrove had a very particular and very dangerous way of relating to the people around him. He divided the world into 2 categories: people who were useful to him and people who were not. And the terrifying thing about being in the first category was that you couldn't always tell when you had shifted into the second. They dated for 18 months. They were good months, genuinely. He was attentive and romantic and seemed to genuinely admire her intelligence, which meant more to Claire than almost any other quality in a partner. He called her brilliant. He asked for her analysis on deals he was considering. He introduced her to his friends and colleagues with a pride that felt real. And when he proposed to her on a trip to Charleston, with the harbor behind them and a ring that was tasteful rather than ostentatious, she said yes with her whole heart. The wedding was small. Claire had no interest in spectacle. 60 people, a beautiful outdoor ceremony, dinner at a restaurant that meant something to both of them. She wore a simple ivory dress and her mother cried so hard she went through 3 Daniel's mother, Margaret Hargrove, a formidably elegant woman with steel grey hair and a perpetual expression of mild disappointment, attended in a St. John's suit, kissed Claire on both cheeks with practiced warmth, and said very little of substance all evening. Claire noticed Margaret's coolness, but chose not to fixate on it. She had married Daniel, not his mother. She was a grown woman who had built her own life. She didn't need anyone's approval to feel secure. That sense of security was one of the first things that began to quietly erode in the months after the wedding. It started small, the way Daniel sometimes spoke to her in front of his friends. Not cruelly, never openly cruel, but with a particular dismissive tone that he never used when they were alone. The way he would reference her work as her little projects, said with a fond smile, as though what she did was a charming hobby, rather than the foundation of a serious financial portfolio. The way he would occasionally make decisions for both of them about social plans, about the house, about money, and then present them to her as though they had already been agreed upon. His expression genuinely puzzled when she pushed back the house was one of the earliest and most significant of those decisions. Daniel had decided they needed a real family home. His penthouse downtown was a bachelor's space, he said. They needed something that matched who they were as a couple now. He had found a property he loved, a large, beautifully renovated colonial in one of the city's best residential neighborhoods. 4 bedrooms, a professional kitchen, a stunning backyard that had been landscaped to perfection. The kind of house that made people slow their cars down when they drove past. Mistress, it was, without question, a beautiful home. Claire loved it too, from the moment she walked through the door, but the conversation about purchasing it became the first major fault line in their marriage, and it happened so quietly that Claire almost missed how significant it was. Daniel had come to her with a deal already structured. His firm's funds were tied up in a current development project, he explained. The timing was simply unfortunate. He needed her to put up the purchase price from her own portfolio, but it would be their house, theirs together, and as soon as his development project closed, within 6 to 8 months, he would reimburse her fully and they would restructure the ownership properly. Claire was not naive. She was, in fact, a professional whose entire career had been built on understanding exactly how property ownership worked and what it meant. She knew with a clarity that no amount of romantic feeling could blur that she should not make this purchase informally, on a handshake and a promise and a feeling. She knew that "we'll sort it out later" was language that courts heard all the time, always after the fact, always when it was too late. So she did something that Daniel did not expect. She agreed to purchase the house, but she told him, very calmly, that since the funds were coming entirely from her, the title would remain in her name alone until such time as they formally restructured the ownership together with proper legal documentation, reviewed by both of their attorneys. She said it matter-of-factly, as though it was simply the rational and obvious thing to do, which it was. She was not accusatory. She was not suspicious. She was simply applying the same professional common sense to her personal life that she applied every single day to her work. Daniel's reaction was the first time. She saw it clearly, that flash of something behind his eyes that wasn't quite anger but was very close to it. He covered it quickly with a laugh and a wave of his hand, said of course, whatever she needed. He trusted her completely. It was fine. But the flash had been there. She had seen it. And some quiet, careful part of her filed it away. The house went into her name. The deed was clean and unambiguous. Claire Marlow, sole owner. She hired a real estate attorney she trusted, made sure all the documentation was bulletproof, and moved into the house with her husband, and tried very hard to simply be happy there. For a while, they settled into the house across the autumn, furnishing it together, filling it with the comfortable rhythms of a shared life. Daniel's development project was progressing. He talked about it often, optimistic in the way that entrepreneurs who have not yet experienced a serious failure tend to be. Claire was still working, still managing her portfolio, still quietly acquiring properties in a way that her husband, if she was honest, had stopped paying close attention to. He had a way of tuning out when she talked about her work. Now that was different from the attentiveness he had shown when they were dating. She noticed it. She didn't confront it. She tucked it away with the other things she was tucking away. And then, on a cold Tuesday morning in February, she took a pregnancy test in the bathroom of the house she owned, and it was positive. She sat, on the edge of the bathtub for a long time, the test in her hand, feeling something so large and complex moving through her that she couldn't name it as a single emotion. There was joy, enormous, almost overwhelming joy. She had wanted a child. She had imagined this moment. She had pictured what her child would look like, how she would love them, what kind of mother she would be, determined, warm, endlessly encouraging, the way her own mother had been. There was joy, undeniably, but there was also something else. A small, quiet, insistent unease that she couldn't entirely silence. Because the relationship that had felt so solid at the start had been showing cracks for months now, and she was carrying those cracks inside her as clearly as she was carrying new life, and she was afraid, and not so afraid that she wasn't going to fight for it, but afraid. Daniel's reaction to the pregnancy news was effusive flowers, an expensive dinner out, phone calls to his parents and friends that same evening. He seemed genuinely thrilled, and in those first weeks, the warmth between them reignited in a way that made Claire wonder if she had been catastrophizing, if the pregnancy was the event that would recalibrate everything and remind them both of what they were building together. His mother Margaret, however, received the news differently. She came to the house 2 weeks later for Sunday lunch, and over the meal and the clipped, precisely worded way that Margaret communicated things she wanted to say but preferred to present as objective observation, she mentioned that she hoped Claire was planning to step back from work at some point, that it was important for a child to have a present mother, that she had always found it rather difficult to understand how a woman could manage a household, a marriage, and a serious professional life simultaneously, and still feel she was doing any of them properly. Claire had smiled and said nothing, and thought a great many things. The pregnancy progressed. Claire managed it the way she managed everything, with capability, with preparation, with the occasional moment of genuine wonder at what her body was doing that she allowed herself when she was alone or with her own mother, who visited him, held her hands and told her she was going to be extraordinary. At work, she was sharp and present. At home, she was trying. She was always trying. But Daniel was changing. It was gradual enough that she kept questioning her own perception, kept wondering if the pregnancy hormones were heightening her sensitivity, kept giving him benefit after benefit of the doubt. He was working longer hours, or said he was. He was distracted at home, present in body but somewhere else in his attention. He was short with her in ways he hadn't been before, quick to become irritable over small things, and then quick to apologize in ways that felt more like procedure than genuine remorse. His development project had hit complications. The numbers weren't where he'd projected them. There were contractors' issues, permit delays, financing complications that he discussed in vague terms she recognized as intentional vagueness, the kind a person uses when they don't want to be asked too many intelligent follow-up questions. She offered to look at the financials with him, to help him problem solve. He declined. He told her it was fine. He told her he had it handled. He did not have it handled. She found out the true shape of his, financial situation on a Sunday morning in her 6th month of pregnancy. By accident, the way people almost always find out the things they have been protected from knowing. She had been looking for the insurance documents for one of her rental properties. She used the study on the ground floor as a home office, and Daniel occasionally worked there too. She opened what she thought was her own file box and found instead a collection of correspondence that told a story she had not been told. His development project was not simply delayed, it was, for all practical purposes, collapsed. There were letters from creditors. There was documentation of a personal loan he had taken 18 months ago that he had never mentioned to her, signed against the projected returns of the project that had not materialized. There was a letter from his firm's accountant with language in it that made Claire, a professional in this industry, feel cold all over. There was a second letter from a contractor he had apparently owed money to for several months, threatening legal action. And there was an email, printed and kept in that box, from a woman named Simone Vasquez, who wrote to Daniel with the easy familiarity of a person who had not written that way for the first time. The email was brief. It was about logistics, a dinner reservation, a question about the following weekend. But the tone of it, the shorthand of it, the way it assumed intimacy, that was what froze Claire where she stood. One hand on the filing box, the other pressed flat against the curve of her pregnant belly. She stood in that study for a very long time. She didn't cry, not at first. She felt almost eerie, very still, the way the air goes very still before something enormous happens. She put everything back exactly as she had found it. She closed the file box. She went to the kitchen, made herself a cup of herbal tea, sat at the kitchen table in the home she owned, and thought with absolute clarity about what she was going to do next. She was 6 months pregnant. She was not going to make any sudden moves. She was not going to confront Daniel with incomplete information. She was not going to dissolve into the emotional chaos that every part of her was begging to descend into. She was going to proceed calmly and carefully and intelligently. She was going to find out exactly what she was dealing with. And then she was going to make decisions from a position of knowledge rather than shock. That week, she called her attorney, not to initiate divorce proceedings, not yet, but to have a quiet, comprehensive, extremely thorough conversation about where she stood. She told her attorney everything, including the financial documents she had seen and the email she had found. Her attorney, a precise and experienced woman named Patricia Nolan, who had known Claire for nearly a decade, listened without interrupting and then spoke for a long time. Patricia told her what she already knew in her heart: that the house was protected, that her portfolio was protected, that her own financial assets were structured in ways that insulated them from Daniel's liabilities. Because she had always kept meticulous documentation and separate legal structures for everything she owned. She had not merged their finances in the way that many married couples did, had not added his name to her accounts or her properties, had not taken on any joint liability that she was not fully in control of. She had built herself, for years, an architecture of independence, not out of distrust for Daniel, not consciously, not at the beginning, but because she was a professional who understood how things worked, and who had never been able to bring herself to abandon the habits of self-sufficiency that had kept her safe her whole life. Those habits were now the only thing standing between her and catastrophe. She hired a private investigator. She told almost no one, only Patricia and her closest friend, a woman named Delia who had known her since college and who received the news about Simone with the controlled fury of someone who loved Claire like a sister. Delia wanted to act. Claire told her to wait. Just wait. The investigator was professional and thorough. Within 2 weeks, he had confirmed what Claire had felt in her bones. Daniel and Simone Vasquez had been together for just over a year. Simone was 27 years old, worked in marketing, and lived in an apartment across town for which, it turned out, Daniel had been quietly paying a portion of the rent from a business account that his firm's accounting troubles had not yet reached. The investigator had photographs, he had documentation, he had a timeline that placed Daniel with Simone on at least a dozen occasions, during which he had told Claire he was working late, or attending client dinners, or dealing with project complications. He had been building a second life while their child grew inside of her, while she had worried over him, given him the benefit of the doubt, bitten back her own instincts, and carried his baby with a kind of quiet, fierce hope he had been building, a second life. Claire received the investigator's report on a Wednesday afternoon. She read every page. She looked at every photograph. She did not break down. She set the file on her desk, laid her hands flat on the surface, looked out the window at the garden of the house she owned, and said out loud to no one, "All right." She did not confront Daniel, nor yet. She understood, with the calculating patience of a woman who had spent her career knowing when to move and when to wait, that the timing of a confrontation matters. She spoke again to Patricia, updated her on everything, and together they began to quietly structure what would need to happen. Property records confirmed. Asset inventories updated. Documentation organized. Nothing that would telegraph to Daniel what was coming. The weeks that followed were the strangest and most painful of Claire's life. She went through the motions of their marriage with a surface that she maintained through sheer force of will. She attended her prenatal appointments, usually alone. As Daniel had stopped accompanying her several months earlier, always with an excuse she now understood the real reason for. She managed her work, her portfolio, her tenants. She sat across the dinner table from her husband and watched him with new eyes. And what she saw was not a complex man struggling with failure and fear, though he was surely that too. What she saw was a man who had looked at her strength, her self-sufficiency, her quiet competence, and had mistaken it for inexhaustibility, had decided, on some level, that because she was capable of managing everything, she did not need to be protected or cherished or shown up for, had decided that her stability made her a fixture rather than a person, had looked at everything she had built and seen something he could lean on rather than something she deserved to be proud of. She saw all of it. She said none of it. She waded that in, Her 8th month, Daniel's firm officially folded. He told her over dinner, stone-faced, his voice carefully controlled. He framed it as a temporary setback, a restructuring, a chance to pivot. He did not tell her about the personal loans. He did not tell her about the creditors. He did not tell her about Simon. He told her a curated, careful version of events that was designed to prompt sympathy and close down questions. And she listened to it with her hands folded on her enormous belly and gave him the sympathy he was performing for. Because she had learned by now that there are moments when the most powerful thing you can do is let someone believe that you believe them. He asked her, that same evening, whether she had thought about putting his name on the deed of the house. Now that the firm was restructuring, it would be cleaner, he said. Better for them as a family, he said. It would just make sense. Given the baby coming and everything they were building together, she told him she would think about it. She did not think about it. The last weeks of her pregnancy were physically demanding and emotionally lonely in a way that she would not have been able to describe to anyone who hadn't felt it. That particular aloneness of carrying an enormous love, an enormous hope inside your body, and having the person who was supposed to be sharing it with you be absent in every way that mattered. Her mother came and stayed for the final 2 weeks, sleeping in the guest room, making her tea and soup, sitting with her in the evenings and talking about nothing and everything. Her mother, who had cleaned other people's houses and raised a daughter who had come to own several of them, was the one who kept Claire rooted during those weeks, who reminded her, without ever knowing the full shape of what was happening, that she had always been enough, that she had always been more than enough. Daniel was home less and less. The explanations were vague. Meetings with lawyers about the firm, consultations with potential investors, the administrative chaos of a business dissolution. She did not ask for more than he offered. She knew where he was. She went into labor on a Thursday morning, 5 days before her due date. While her husband was not home, she had known for days that it was close. Her body had been telling her in the quiet, insistent language that bodies use. She woke at 3 in the morning with contractions that were real and regular, and she lay in the dark room of her house for 20 minutes by herself before calling her mother, who was in the guest room down the hall and who appeared at her door. Within 30 seconds, fully alert in the way that a lifetime of love makes you, she called Daniel at 3:20 in the morning. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail, and she left a message. Her voice was steady, and she was proud of that steadiness in that moment being the hardest and most necessary thing. She told him the baby was coming. She told him they were going to the hospital. She told him she needed him there. She called twice more from the car on the way to the hospital. Both times, voicemail. Her mother held her hand in the delivery room. Her mother was the one who stood beside her through 8 hours of labor, who held her upright and talked her through the worst of it and cried with abandon at the end of it when a small, furious, astonishing new person came into the world. A girl, dark-haired and loud and perfect in a way that dissolved every other thought in Claire's mind for a long, blazing moment of pure, uncut wonder. They named her Grace. Claire had chosen the name months earlier. Alone, knowing she would be the one, choosing. Daniel arrived at the hospital for hours after Grace was born. He came through the door with flowers and apologies and a story about his phone being on silent. During an important call with a potential investor in Dubai, the kind of explanation designed to be technically plausible while explaining nothing real. He held Grace with what appeared to be genuine emotion, and for a few minutes, Claire watched him and felt something so complicated she couldn't name it. Grief, perhaps, for everything that could have been and wasn't, for the man he might have been if he were a different person. Or if she were a less consequential person for him to have underestimated. She did not say any of what she was thinking. She'll let him hold his daughter. She watched his face as he did, and she thought, this child is the reason I waited. This child is the reason I did everything correctly. And I have done everything correctly. What Claire did not know, or she would not know for another 6 hours, when her neighbor called her hospital room and spoke in a voice that was carefully and unsuccessfully calm, was what Daniel had been doing the night before in the morning of Grace's birth. Her neighbor, a 60-year-old woman named Helen, who had lived next door for 20 years and had the moral backbone of a Supreme Court justice, called at 2 in the afternoon. Grace was sleeping in the hospital bassinet. Claire's mother had stepped out to get food. Claire answered her phone with the fog-soft warmth of a new mother, and listened as Helen told her, carefully and with evident discomfort, what she had witnessed over the past 16 hours. A woman had arrived at Claire's house the previous evening, while Claire was already in labor and not yet aware of it. She had arrived in a taxi with 2 large suitcases. Daniel had met her at the front door. Helen had watched from her living room window. She was not a gossip. She would want Claire to know that. But she had always liked Claire, and she was a woman who believed that people deserved to know the truth. The woman, dark-haired, young, looking entirely at home, had carried her suitcases inside. The lights in the house had been on late. Helen had seen them through the windows, moving through the kitchen, talking, laughing. In the morning, she had seen the young woman on Claire's back porch in a robe that appeared to be Claire's. In fact, the pale blue one that Claire wore on weekend mornings, drinking coffee as if she had always lived there. Helen had called twice before reaching Claire. She was sorry to be the one saying this. She thought Claire should know. Claire listened to all of it with the phone pressed against her ear and her free hand resting on the edge of the bassinet where her hours-old daughter slept. She listened to every word. She thanked Helen. She told her she was grateful. She asked her one question. Was the young woman still there, to Helen's knowledge? Helen said she believed so. She had seen her in the backyard as recently as an hour ago. Claire hung up the phone. She sat for a long moment in the hospital room that smelled of disinfectant and flowers, and that particular electric silence of new life, and she felt something shift inside her with the finality of a key turning in a lock. This was the moment, not the moment she had planned for, not the carefully structured confrontation she had rehearsed. This, right here. In a hospital room with a newborn daughter who needed her to be unshakable. She called Patricia Nolan. Patricia answered on the second ring, because Claire had made it clear weeks ago that she was to answer on the second ring of Claire call. She told Patricia everything Helen had told her. There was a brief silence, and then Patricia, in the voice of a woman who had spent 30 years making things happen, said, "Tell me what you want and I'll make it happen by this time tomorrow," Claire told her. Then she called Delia, who picked up on the first ring and who listened with the escalating fury of someone who'd been waiting months for this moment, and then said, with absolute calm, "Tell me what you need me to do." Claire told her that, and then she called Daniel. He answered immediately, because he was still in the hospital, had stayed, perhaps out of guilt, perhaps out of something more complicated, and she could hear the distant sounds of the hospital cafeteria. In the background, she told him to come back to her room. She had something to tell him about the house. He came back with a coffee cup and a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, and she looked at him from the hospital bed with their daughter sleeping between them, and she said, very quietly, very clearly, "I know Simone is at the house right now, Dunya. I know everything. And I need you to understand something before tomorrow morning." The coffee cup didn't fall, but only because he gripped it so hard his knuckles went white. The color left his face in a way that was almost dramatic, almost satisfying. She would not pretend it wasn't, at least a little. He started to speak. She lifted one hand, very slightly, and he stopped. She told him that she had known about Simone for months. She told him she had a full investigator's report. She told him she had spoken to her attorney. She told him that the house where Simone Vasquez was currently drinking coffee in Claire's robe on Claire's back porch was, and had always been, solely in Claire's name, with documentation that was airtight, reviewed, and up to date. She told him that she had spent the past 3 months ensuring that every single financial asset she owned was fully documented and legally insulated from his firm's collapse. She told him that she had been patient and careful and professional, in the same way she was always patient and careful and professional, and that she had done so not out of strategy but out of the belief that she owed it to her daughter, handled this correctly. And then she told him that she needed Simone Vasquez out of her house by 9 o'clock the next morning. He tried several things in sequence. He tried denial, which lasted approximately 4 seconds, against the expression on her face. He tried a version of confession laced with justification, the pressure of the business, the distance he'd felt between them, the fear that he wasn't enough for her, the usual architecture of a man trying to distribute the blame for his own choices. She let him talk. She did not respond to any of it. He tried contrition, real or performed, his voice breaking, his eyes getting wet, a hand reaching toward hers on the bed. She withdrew her hand. She told him she was not discussing the marriage tonight. She told him she had just given birth to his daughter and she was exhausted and she intended to sleep. She told him that when she came home from the hospital, she expected the house to be as she had left it, her home, belonging to her, and that if it was not, she had already asked Patricia Nolan to have a locksmith and a sheriff's deputy ready to facilitate the necessary outcome. She told him, finally, that she hoped he would choose to handle this quietly, for Grace's sake as much as anything else. and that she genuinely did not want this to be more painful than it needed to be, but that she wanted to be absolutely clear she would not be the woman in this story who ended up without a home, without resources, without a future, simply because a man had assumed that her love for him made her manageable. She had never been manageable. She had simply been patient. Daniel left the hospital an hour later. She heard nothing from him until 8:15 the next morning, when he sent a single text message that said the house was clear. She didn't respond. Her mother came back that evening, and Claire told her everything, and her mother held her for a long time without saying anything except, at the end, "I always knew you would be all right. I always knew it," Claire cried then. Finally, not the broken crying of someone whose world had ended, but the clean, releasing crying of someone who had been holding something enormous for a very long time and could finally set it down. She cried for the marriage she had believed in and lost. She cried for the version of Daniel she had once thought she saw. She cried for every lonely prenatal appointment, every dinner table silence, every night she had talked herself out of work. She knew, and then she stopped crying, dried her face, looked at her daughter sleeping in the bassinet, and felt something settle in her chest that felt remarkably like peace. She came home from the hospital 2 days later with Grace in a car seat and her mother beside her, and she walked through the front door of her house, and stood in the entrance hall and breathed it in. It was still hers. Every room, every surface, every window that caught the morning light in exactly the way she had chosen when she fell in love with this place. It was hers. It had always been hers. The weeks that followed were the full storm before the clearing. Daniel had emerged, had not handled things quietly. He had talked to his friends, to his mother, to Simone, and the narrative he had constructed was one in which Claire had been cold and withholding during the marriage, had cared more about money and property than about their relationship, had kept him at arm's length professionally and emotionally, and had now used her financial advantage to force him out of the home. He considered his as much as hers. The narrative circulated. It reached people they knew. It reached his mother, Margaret, who called Claire and said, in that clipped, precise way of hers, that she hoped Claire wasn't going to make this ugly, that Daniel was under enormous stress, that perhaps a period of separation rather than an immediate divorce would allow everyone to find perspective. Claire listened very politely to every word Margaret said, and then said, equally politely, that she had no intention of making anything ugly, but that she did intend to make things honest, and that if Margaret was concerned about ugliness, she might direct that concern toward her son's choices over the past year. There was a silence on the line, and then Margaret said, still clipped, still precise, but with something slightly different in it, something that might have been the very first acknowledgement of a complicated truth that she understood, and she hung up. Delia came and stayed for a week, bringing food and fierce companionship and a talent for making Claire laugh at moments when laughter felt both impossible and necessary. Other friends appeared, some who surprised her, who she hadn't expected to show up and did, and some who she had expected to be there and quietly weren't. She learned, in those weeks, the exact and specific geography of her actual community who loved her, who was merely adjacent, and who had only been there because of the shrine she had been standing next to. She filed for divorce. Patricia handled everything with the precision and thoroughness of someone who had been building toward this for months, because she had been. The settlement negotiations were contentious in the way that such things always are when one party has assets, and the other has liabilities, and both have a lawyer who is very, very good. Daniel's attorney attempted numerous angles. They tried to argue that the house constituted marital property despite the clear title documentation. They tried to argue that Claire's investment portfolio had grown during the marriage in ways that were influenced by Daniel's professional network and advice. They tried to argue that Daniel's contributions to the household, including his income during the early part of the marriage, before the firm collapsed, entitled him to a significant financial settlement. Patricia dismantled every argument with the unhurried confidence of someone who is prepared for every possible angle. The house title was clean, thoroughly documented, and not subject to any credible counterclaim. Claire's investment portfolio predated the marriage and had been independently managed throughout. Patricia had documentation of every acquisition, every financial decision, every professional consultation, none of which involved Daniel in any material way. As for Daniel's financial contributions to the household, his own accountant ultimately confirmed that, in the final 18 months of the marriage, he had not contributed to household expenses at all, had in fact been drawing quietly on a joint household account that Claire had been the primary depositor into, to fund, among other things, Simone Vasquez's rent. That last detail, when it emerged in the discovery process, was the one that finally broke what remained of Daniel's negotiating position. He had spent Claire's money on his mistress's apartment while she was pregnant with his child. That was not a story anyone could spin. The divorce was finalized 7 months after Grace was born. Claire received full custody of Grace, subject to a standard visitation arrangement for Daniel that his attorneys had fought for and gotten, and that Claire had agreed to. Because despite everything, she was not the kind of person who used a child as a weapon. Grace deserved a father. Whatever Daniel was to Claire, he was still Grace's father. And Claire would not allow her own pain to override her daughter's needs. It was one of the hardest things she had ever done, and she did it because she was the kind of mother she had. Always planned to be fierce, clear-eyed, and big enough to put her child first. Daniel received no claim on the house. He received no claim on Claire's portfolio. He received the modest shared assets they had accumulated during the marriage, minus the amount that was determined to have been misused from their joint account. He left the marriage with significantly less than he had entered it with, and with a firm that was gone and a reputation in their industry that had taken serious damage from the financial collapse. He had arrived in Claire's life as a man who seemed to have everything, and he had left it diminished in almost every measurable way. Simone Vasquez, it turned out, had not waited around for the outcome. She had departed, quietly and without fanfare, approximately 2 months into the divorce process. When it became clear that Daniel's financial picture was considerably less attractive than it had appeared, Daniel, to his credit or perhaps simply to his distress, did not seem to have expected that. But Claire, who understood the arithmetic of people who are attracted to resources rather than persons, was not surprised at all. By the time Grace was 14 months old and taking her first unsteady, triumphant steps across the living room floor of the house on Meridian Lane, Claire's life had been rebuilt in ways that were quieter and stronger and better than what had come before. Her portfolio had continued to grow. She had made 2 additional acquisitions in the year following the divorce. Properties that her trained eye told her would appreciate significantly, and they were already beginning to prove her right. She had taken on 2 junior analysts at her firm, women she was mentoring with the same fierce belief in capability that her own mother had always shown her. She had repainted the house in colors she had always wanted and never quite chosen during the marriage. She had planted a kitchen garden in the backyard where Simone Vasquez had once stood in her robe drinking coffee, and she found a particular satisfaction every time she went out there to pick herbs that she couldn't entirely explain, and didn't need to. She was not without scars. She would be lying if she claimed that the betrayal hadn't left its marks in the extra beat of caution she felt now before trusting. In the occasional middle-of-the-night weight that settled on her chest when Grace was asleep in the house, was quiet, and she let herself feel the full shape of what had happened. She had loved Daniel, imperfectly and with some part of her always held back in self-protection. But she had loved him, and the loss of that love, or rather, the loss of the version of him she had believed in, was real, and took time, and didn't resolve cleanly the way narrative satisfaction demands. But she was not broken. She had not been broken. And she had known, all along, through every careful decision she had ever made, that she would not be. There was a moment, about a year after the divorce was finalized, that Claire would return to in her memory for the rest of her life as the moment when she understood everything completely. She was sitting on the back porch of her house on a September evening, Grace asleep inside, a glass of wine in her hand. In the kitchen garden lit by the last light of the setting sun, her phone buzzed with a message from Delia, who had just seen that Daniel had announced on social media that he was starting a new property venture, a modest one. Nothing like his former firm, but a start. Delia had sent 3 eye-roll emails and a gif of someone falling off a chair. Claire laughed a real laugh, unguarded and free. She set her phone down and looked out at the garden and at the house behind her, and at the last gold light on the leaves of the old oak tree at the back of the yard that she had loved from the first time she had seen it. She had bought this house with her own money, her own work, her own years of patient and careful building. She had protected it with her own knowledge and her own foresight. She had kept it through her own strength at the worst moment of her life. And it was still here. It was still hers. The house had always been hers. She had just needed everyone else to find that out. There are women who are strong because life has given them no other option. And there are women who are strong because they decided, very early, and very quietly, that strength was the only foundation worth building on. Claire Marlow was the second kind. And the remarkable thing, the thing that Daniel Hargrove never understood, not when he married her and not when he tried to dismantle her, was that her strength was never the cold, defensive armor of someone who had been hurt too many times to feel. It was something warmer and more formidable than that. It was the strength of a woman who knew her own worth with the same professional precision she applied to every property she had ever valued completely, accurately, and without sentimentality. She had known, when she bought that house, exactly what she was doing. She had known, when she kept meticulous documentation of her assets, exactly why. She had known, when she lay in that hospital bed with her newborn daughter and her phone ringing silently somewhere across the city, that she was not a woman whose story ended in loss. Some women get to be the person who is saved. Claire Marlow was always going to be the one who saved herself. She had just been waiting for everyone else to catch up. Grace grew into a bright, loud, laughing little girl who had a mother's dark eyes and a stubbornness that everyone who knew Claire recognized immediately and found both exhausting and wonderful. She visited her father on the schedule the court had set, and came home to her mother with the energy of someone who has two homes and knows she is loved in both of them. And that is as much as a child can ask for, and more than many get. Claire watched her daughter grow and thought about what she would teach her, not the obvious things. The practical lessons about money and property and the importance of documentation. Though she would teach those too and teach them well, what she thought about was something harder to put into words. Something she had learned not from any professional course or mentor, but from the specific and irreplaceable education of having gone through fire and come out the other side with everything that mattered intact. She would teach Grace that love is real and worth believing in, and that it is also absolutely no reason to abandon your own good judgment. She would teach her that patience is not the same as passivity, and that the ability to wait for the right moment is one of the most powerful things a person can possess. She would teach her that the things you build for yourself with your own hands, your own mind, your own years of unglamorous careful work are the things that remain when everything else falls away. She would teach her that being underestimated is not a wound, it is an advantage. Use it well. She would teach her all of this, not in lectures, in the living of it, which is the only teaching that really holds. On Grace's second birthday, stood in the kitchen of the house on Meridian Lane and looked around at what her life had become. Her mother was at the kitchen table, feeding Grace small pieces of birthday cake with the focused delight of a grandmother, who has no higher purpose in this moment than this exact one. Delia was laughing at something from the living room, sound of her filling the house the way it always did. A handful of close friends moved through the rooms with the comfortable ease of people who belonged there. The kitchen garden was visible through the window, late summer green, abundant and unhurried. The house held all of it, warmly, solidly, permanently. The way good structures do. She had built this, every bit of it. The house and the garden and the life inside it and the woman she had become. She had built all of it herself, and not one piece of it could be taken from her. The door to the back porch was open, and a late summer breeze moved through the house, and Grace squealed with delight at her grandmother, and Claire stood in the middle of it all and felt with a completeness she had never quite known before and would carry with her always, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be, in her house, on her terms, living the life that she had built with her own extraordinary, careful, determined, unbreakable hands. Some people spend their whole lives waiting to be chosen by someone who recognizes their worth. Claire Marlow had chosen herself, long before any of this, long before Daniel Hartgrove ever walked into a room and turned his attention on her and mistook the warmth in her eyes for something he could use. She had chosen herself, and she had never once looked back.